Tonight on The Late Debate, unlocking London. Finally, we can shop, eat and drink out again, but the South African variant of COVID is alarming scientists. Plus, the rise of smart motorways to help tackle traffic, but how safe are they?
People just couldn't believe what had happened to him, you know, and he didn't deserve to die that way. Nobody deserves to die that way.
Good evening. The shops are open. You can go out for a drink or a meal. You can finally get your hair cut and go to the gym. That's made a lot of us in London and the home counties very happy. But in a worrying development this week, people in 4 London boroughs were found to be carrying the South African variant of COVID. 1 minute after midnight on Monday morning, and regulars at the Kentish Bell in Bexley Heath eagerly embraced the change in lockdown rules.
It's good to be out, regardless of the time and the weather.
It's great to be at the pub again, have that social atmosphere, the interaction.
A few hours later, and it was the turn of the West End to come back to life.
Let's get some trainers,
Early morning queues signalled the return of shopping in shops, but the stores think it'll be another year before business bounces back to where it was.
I think what's different about this reopening is the vaccine. I think people are more comfortable now that we're getting close to herd immunity in Britain. People have had the vaccination, so it does feel like people do want to come out.
For many, the most welcome change was the reopening of hair salons, although staff must still wear masks and visors.
I can't say it's the most comfortable thing in the world, but you just crack on.
A chilly Monday night saw Soho packed.
Monday's the new Friday.
But as the party got underway, there was a sobering reminder that the pandemic is still out there. Cases of the South African variant were discovered in 2 South London boroughs. By Tuesday morning, there were queues across Clapham Common as people in Lambeth and Wandsworth answered the call to get tested.
Across Wandsworth and Lambeth, there are over 650,000 people that we are trying to get to come for a test. We're targeting people over the age of 11, so secondary school age children and adults.
The next significant milestone on the government's roadmap is still more than 4 weeks away, when, if all goes to plan, eating and drinking indoors will be allowed and theatres will finally reopen. So what should happen? To discuss this, we're joined in the studio by Tan Dessy, the Labour MP for Slough, and for the Conservatives, the Beaconsfield MP Joy Morrissey, and from her St Albans office, the local MP and Liberal Democrat Deputy Leader Daisy Cooper. Welcome all of you. Infection rates are going down, vaccinations are going up. Joy, there's still some people in your party who think the roadmap is too slow. Do you think it is?
I support the roadmap. I think we're on the road to freedom, and I think it matches the level of vaccination so that we have a higher level of vaccination as things open up in a safe way, permanently, rather than a stop and start approach.
Tan, you still have some quite high levels, don't you, in Slough, even higher than London, and you've had a bit of a history there. Are you worried?
Well, Slough, unfortunately, has been very, very hard hit by the pandemic. But now I think what we need to do is to get as many people as possible vaccinated. So, I want to commend the amazing work of all of our NHS and public health teams. But going forward, we need to make sure that we are open and transparent with people. We need to secure our borders and ensure that the likes of the South African variant and the Brazilian variant, that we limit its ingress into the country.
You talk about borders, of course, people in your constituency particularly exposed because a lot of them work at Heathrow.
Yes, and unfortunately the aviation sector has been particularly hard hit. So what we have been calling for, or the likes of myself on behalf of Slough constituents have been calling for, is that we need to have that quarantining, that system in place, but we need to have adequate support for our aviation sector. And that's unfortunately the government to date has not given that sector specific deal which the aviation sector so desperately needs.
Daisy, how relaxed are you about the pace of the roadmap?
Well, I'm very pleased and relieved, actually, that the Prime Minister is finally being cautious after an entire year of boom and bust lockdowns. We have got these new variants, and that's a reminder that we need to remain cautious. But what Liberal Democrats have been saying for an entire year now is that lockdowns are a very blunt instrument, and the one thing that is going to help us manage this pandemic is to have a fully functioning test, trace and isolate system, and the tracing part and the isolation part are still not working well enough.
Why is that, Joy?
Well, I think they are actually working, and there's a significant improvement. We had the South African variant in my constituency, and we had surge testing. It covered the whole of the ward. They were able to administer the tests, and they were able to contain the virus. So I saw how this process has developed over the past year, and I think we are in a much stronger position now to adequately deal with test and trace.
Simon, I would say that the test and trace system is one of the reasons why we have had the highest death toll in Europe, and why more than 125,000 people have lost their lives, why we are now facing the worst economic crisis of any major economy. Had the government done as many of us had been advocating, to put that test and trace system within our NHS, within our local public health teams, then I think that the impact of the pandemic on our nation would have been a lot less. And we've seen that with the vaccination programme. Once we entrust it to the NHS and to local primary care trusts, then we have a successful vaccination programme. We should not be privatising just for the sake of privatising, because ultimately that would lead to a disaster for public health as well as our economy.
With the appearance of new variants and what we've seen with the surge testing, do you detect any appetite among politicians for perhaps more local restrictions where these variants appear, perhaps even going back to the tier system? What do you think, Daisy?
As I say, lockdowns are an incredibly blunt instrument, and if the science says that we need to have them because the new variants spread much faster, then of course we will follow the scientific advice, and I hope the government does too. The problem is that we do still need this functioning test, trace and isolate system, and Joy's talked about all the surge testing that the government has instructed, but test, trace, isolate is a three-legged stool, and tracing and isolation are still not working. We really need to have enhanced contact tracing with cognitive interview skills to remind people of places that they might have otherwise forgotten they've been. We need a much more enhanced supported isolation, so that people in isolation are getting visited on a daily basis to support their well-being and mental health, and they're getting the finance that they need, the financial support to support them and anybody that they live with in their household and any dependents as well, and it's still not working.
Tan, would people in Slough accept localised restrictions or a return to the tier system?
Look, whatever the system is, it's got to be fair and transparent. You will have seen that the likes of myself raised it in the House earlier. When Slough was isolated, it was treated as a special example in comparison to the rest of the region, and in fact the rest of the country. But whatever we do, we need to ensure that it is transparent, that it's fair. If people do not think it is fair, then people will not end up following the guidelines. And what we also need to do is to make sure that there is adequate support. At the moment, sick pay, we do not even have decent sick pay. So how are we expecting people to isolate if we do not provide adequate support to them? Because then it becomes a choice between testing and doing and isolating, doing the right thing, or feeding their families. That's not a position where we want to be in.
Joy, how worried are you about a third wave?
We're very freedom-loving in Bucks, and everyone, I think, would like to move out permanently of the lockdown and move forward in how we live and continue to have business with COVID, living with the virus, rather than shutting down and having a lockdown again. I would say that's probably the view across my constituency, but I think that people have been very respectful of the current roadmap, and we are all trying to follow it, and we are hoping that this is the last.
But if it wasn't, or if a variant popped up and there had to be some localised restrictions, do you think you could sell it to your constituents?
Well, it was very easy to sell the surge testing because the NHS and the government have worked hand in hand, and it was a very good public health message that went out to every constituent in the area. The tests were available for them. They were dropped off at their door. So it was a much more streamlined, joined up process, and our council is excellent. I have to really praise Bucks Unitary Council. They're really wonderful, and that joined up approach has made all the difference.
All three of you spoke in the Commons today in response to Daisy's urgent question about the plight of students during the pandemic. You talked, Daisy, about a wrecked academic year. That's quite strong language.
Yeah, well, I think a number of university students feel as though they've had a really, really raw deal over the last year. They were initially they were all encouraged to go back to university, and then, of course, many of them found themselves, in some cases, behind barriers and security fences in their halls of residence because a proper system to migrate students back to university hadn't been put in place. Then they were in lockdown without access to the libraries and labs and face-to-face teaching, so much of their teaching that they did have was online, which didn't give them the full university experience. Then they were told that they couldn't go home for Christmas, and then we had to sort of beg to get a process where they could go home for Christmas. Then they were told they couldn't go back to university after Christmas, and then when the roadmap was laid out, they weren't even given a date when they would be considered. And many of these students have had, not only have they lost out on their university experience, they've lost out on learning, they've paid huge amounts of money for fees and for rent, and some of them are now having to rely on food banks. And so what's really frustrating is, first of all, the government announced the date where 1 million students can return on the 17th of May, but for some students that is actually after their courses have finished, so they feel very neglected and forgotten, and for many there simply hasn't been enough financial support.
Joy, has the government neglected students?
They have laid out the plan for university students, but for each individual university, which is an independent institution, they do have early end dates for their classes. And what I asked today in Parliament was, could the minister actually ask universities to extend their teaching time? Many of them will stop in May. Could they continue till June, just so that there can be that interface with the teacher? Because I think it's very, very important. I know for my experience in university at LSE, I loved the student experience just as much as the classroom learning, and these students have had none of that, and I think it's actually unfair. So if universities could be flexible, I would be very grateful on that.
Tan, you spoke in the debate about the fees, the £9,500. Do you think students should be compensated?
Well, Simon, the reason why the likes of myself spoke today, and I want to thank Daisy for raising that urgent question and for securing that, is because students have been badly let down by the government over the past year. The students have not had the full benefit of a university education, just as the likes of myself had the chance earlier in our life. The tuition fees are exorbitant in terms of to pay £9,250 when they are not getting the full benefit of that. The accommodation rent payments, when they are not actually residing in university, many of them are studying from home, and a lot of the time the online support hasn't been there, as well as the impact on their mental health. So that is why I think students are getting a raw deal and why they need that support from government.
OK, let's put COVID aside for the moment. Now, anyone driving into London along the M4 in the last few years will be all too aware of the huge project to create the latest so-called smart motorway. It's costing hundreds of millions of pounds to do away with the hard shoulder and create an extra traffic lane. But there are growing concerns that smart motorways can be lethal. When Sally Jacobs' husband Derek left their North London home to drive to Yorkshire 2 years ago, there was no reason to think he wouldn't be back later that day. But on the M1, just south of Sheffield, his van blew a tyre. Because he was on a so-called smart motorway, there was no hard shoulder.
He got out the passenger side, and before he could get over the barrier, a car hit his van, crushing it onto him, I assume. The car then turned over and a coach hit the car. Nobody deserves to die that way.
Derek's death is one of a number which have prompted calls for smart motorways to be scrapped, but the government is committed to them. The M25 is already a smart motorway. There's a lane of traffic instead of a hard shoulder. Part of the M4 through West London and Berkshire is being converted at a cost of more than £800 million. Drivers we spoke to had their doubts.
You don't get to choose where you break down. And yet the government says wait another couple of miles to pull over to the side. You don't always get that choice.
You haven't very much choice. If there isn't a hard shoulder, you're just going to pile into the vehicles either side of you.
I've come close a few times myself to rear-ending something that's just stopped.
In March, the government published what it called an evidence stocktake, which recommended more refuge areas where drivers can pull over and radar systems which can spot stranded vehicles. In a statement, Highways England said, the government's evidence stocktake of the safety of smart motorways analysed a wealth of data and found that in most ways they're as safe as or safer than conventional motorways. We are committed to delivering the stocktake actions to further raise the bar on smart motorway safety.
We know that if a vehicle stops in a live lane, there is a more than 200% increase or risk in them being involved in a collision, and that is really, really worrying. Breaking down at the best of times is a terrifying experience. You don't want to be doing that on a motorway, but if you do it in a live lane, for drivers that would be an absolutely terrifying experience.
Sally is now a campaigner against smart motorways.
You put on a brave face for everybody, but in your heart you die a little more every day without him.
The M4's makeover is due to be complete at the end of next year. Current plans will see 800 miles of smart motorway in England by 2025.
Well, Joy, Daisy and Tan all represent constituencies connected by smart motorways. Tan, they were introduced under a Labour government first. How alarmed are you by them?
Look, there are different types of smart motorway, and I was in the House when my good friend, the Shadow Transport Secretary, Jim McMahon, actually raised this issue and requested the Transport Secretary that we need to put an end to smart motorways wherein there is no hard shoulder. And that was after early this year we've held a virtual roundtable with experts and with the relatives of those whose family members have sadly passed away, because there have been more than 38 fatalities at least. I think this is something that the government needs to be looking into very, very closely, and unfortunately we haven't had the right response from the Transport Secretary as yet.
Joy, that was an awful story we heard there from Sally Jacobs. Are smart motorways just a cut-price way of achieving an extra lane at the expense of the hard shoulder?
Well, no one wants to see anyone die in a vehicular accident. I mean, that was a very tragic story. And I think I understand where the government, both Labour and Conservative, have come from and the challenges. But for me personally, in the IVAs, we've had serious issues and complaints about sound pollution and getting the sound barrier, and we've been battling with Highways England to try to get that mitigation for our local residents, because not only is there a safety issue, but for me locally, there's a real issue of noise pollution and the impact.
And it's only going to get worse with smart motorways because they're going to increase the volume of traffic.
So there are these local issues and the mitigation of how I think also Highways England can work with local MPs and local areas to make sure that all the safety measures that we're recommending and mitigation measures are in place.
Daisy, where do the Lib Dems stand on smart motorways?
Well, clearly, I think Sally's experience is just heartbreaking, and I think public confidence is incredibly low at the moment in smart motorways. And so we would like to see a review into whether or not they should continue at all. I think obviously they work in theory and we can see why they might want to be introduced, but smart motorways rely on technology. And I was incredibly concerned in March of this year when new analysis shows that a Highways England investigation showed up that 15% of stranded vehicles in a test 8-mile period, 15% of stranded vehicles were not being picked up by the detection system. And that's incredibly worrying and has led to the Secretary of State getting the Office of Rail and Road involved to look at that evidence once again. So I don't think that the government should continue with the rollout until we have seen this additional analysis of this data, until people can have full confidence that it can be rolled out with no fatalities as a result.
Can you convince the government to pause? I'd imagine not.
Well, look, we will continue to ask those questions and request that there needs to be a hard shoulder under all circumstances, because as was very eloquently pointed out in your report, that unless we have that, we will have more and more sad instances as experienced by Sally, because nobody knows when and where they will end up breaking down. And the last thing you want to do is to break down in a fully flowing motorway and not in the hard shoulder, because then you're putting your life as well as the lives of other motorists at risk.
It's a terrifying prospect, that, isn't it?
Terrifying. And you don't want to see anyone in those circumstances. And I think working with local partnerships and local authorities, that would really help improve the overall deliverability.
Okay, thank you for the moment there. Now, in a week dominated by the death of the Duke of Edinburgh, it's been easy to overlook the loss of other significant figures, such as Baroness Shirley Williams, the Liberal Democrat who in the 1970s was the MP for Hertford and Stevenage, and also the Conservative MP for Chesham and Amersham, Dame Cheryl Gillan, who's died after a long illness. Both of them very familiar figures in Parliament. Daisy, obviously, Shirley Williams is somebody you must have known extremely well.
Do you know what? I think Ed Davey described her as a liberal lion, and she was a real trailblazer for all women in politics, because she was, of course, one of the very first female cabinet ministers. I think most of us will remember Shirley for being very, very astute, having a very, very sharp mind, but having a lot of human warmth and being able to take a joke at her own expense as well as at everybody else's as well. I think there have been so many really fond tributes of Shirley being made over the last few days, and we'll all really, really miss her.
Tan, in her time, Shirley was obviously regarded as a traitor by many in the Labour Party for leaving to set up the Social Democratic Party and then moving to the Lib Dems. But there were a lot of warm words even from Labour. She was said to be the leader that you never had.
Well, look, it was wonderful that to see people from across the political spectrum coming together, and that's when I think the House is at its best, when tributes were paid to Shirley Williams as well as Dame Cheryl Gillen and the late MP Ian Gibson, and all of them have had a significant impact on our polity. In terms of Dame Cheryl Gillen, she was somebody who was from one of the neighbouring constituencies to mine, and I met her for a long conversation in 2019 when we had an Understanding Autism awareness training event, because she not only represented her constituency, but in terms of autism she did a great deal to raise awareness and to ensure that the government placed emphasis on that. In terms of Shirley Williams, I think she is a colossal figure, not just as a former cabinet minister, as a leader of the Lib Dems in the Lords, and she will be sorely missed by so many.
Joy, praise there for a Conservative MP from a Labour MP. Cheryl, you knew well. I mean, she was described by some as a sort of mother hen to new MPs in the Conservative group.
She really was, and she took us under her wing as new Bucks MPs. We felt one of the greatest privileges was having Dame Cheryl as our mentor. She was always making sure we were okay, checking up on us, and I think she served her constituents until the very end. Even when she was ill, until the very, very end, she was on the call every single week with Bucks MPs, speaking to constituents, helping them. She put her constituents above everyone else, and her work on autism was truly groundbreaking and led the way in Parliament on that front.
And she wasn't shy about saying what she thought about HS2, was she?
I was just about to say, Simon, I tell you what, as a Shadow Rail Minister, that was there wasn't a rail debate without Cheryl standing up and talking about how bad HS2 is. So that's just it's something that we'll miss, I think.
Tan, Joy, Daisy, thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight. That's all from The Late Debate. We'll be back next month when we'll know who the winners and losers are for the local election and who's running City Hall. Good night.